The God of War series has had something of a renaissance in recent years, with an updated and frankly grown-up approach that fits better with modern audience tastes and the broader audience appeal of video games today. And that's not a nostalgic backhanded compliment. The recent God of War games have been exceptional. But join me for a moment as we fire up the PS2 and dive back into the OG God of War and see if it holds up. The year is 2005. The Star Wars prequel trilogy is coming to an end, and nobody thought it could get worse. Voldemort returned, or Geldof returned. Brad left Jen for Angelina, and Hurricane Katrina is about to rip apart entire towns and cities, impacting the lives of hundreds of thousands for more than a decade to come. Sorry to be a downer with that last one there, but lots of other shit things happened that year too. But hey, we got YouTube.
Chocolate rain.
Meanwhile, gamers were learning about Greek gods and getting RSI from button mashing X to kill them. That's right, get ready to feel old those of you who remember, because almost 20 years ago, the original God of War landed on PS2.
The mortal who had become the new God of War.
There it is! There it is!
So, let's deal with the elephant in the room, QuickTime events. It's important to note that God of War was not the first game to implement QuickTime events, or even to bring them to that generation, but God of War certainly became synonymous with the mechanic. In God of War, QuickTime events were mostly implemented as interactive cutscenes, in which Kratos would finish off enemies in particularly gory but also undeniably spectacular ways. In this way, they felt quite new and fresh, a reward for grinding down a tough enemy or a cinematic way to resolve a boss battle. It's hard to remember precisely after 20 years of rotting my brain, but a quick Google didn't turn up reviews bemoaning the use of QuickTime events at the time. Indeed, their success in games like God of War saw them spread out across much of the industry. Telltale would later effectively build a genre on the back of QuickTime events and player choices. Unfortunately, by the time God of War 3 and Heavy Rain released, QuickTime events were being seen as overused, lazy, and repetitive by the bulk of the audience, and the memes were becoming more and more prevalent online. That's not to say they've gone away entirely. The legacy of QuickTime events persists even to the current gen, often used as a way to keep the player feeling a part of a cinematic set piece, with top-rated titles such as Uncharted and Spider-Man making use of the mechanic. Interestingly, the modern God of War games have certainly dialed back on the use of QuickTime events, and there's even been articles and discussion online from gamers who missed the QuickTime events. I can't say I'm one of them, but I get it. But what about the gameplay more broadly? God of War is at its core a hack-and-slash based game, with combos that can be taken either at face value or as a personal challenge to master. Playing on the original hardware, it's a pleasant surprise at how well combat holds up, and how fun trying to get the combo up can be. Naturally, you will still come across some clunkiness or what a modern gamer would consider odd interactions or moments, but for the most part, combat feels great. Timing blocks and dodges feel satisfying, and there's a variety of combos to land and enemies to fight to keep you from getting bored. The occasional puzzle or platforming sections also keep you fresh and engaged, managing to keep you from becoming desensitized to the violence and mayhem that Kratos is unleashing across the ancient Greek world. These sections, though, are definitely the sections that suffer the most when you go back. The lack of camera control makes platforming a rather frustrating experience, coupled with the sometimes clunky controls by modern standards, and you can find yourself struggling to balance on beams or make relatively simple jumps, especially when the camera switches mid-movement and throws off your sense of direction. Certainly not the worst experience, but jarring compared to the quite fluid combat experience. Puzzles are generally straightforward enough. However, you can occasionally find yourself faced with an impassable obstacle that requires you to backtrack and acquire a specific item or ability. In an era of large open worlds, it's rare to experience these hard stops in your path, and in more modern games, solutions are usually nearby. One particular problem early in the game found me lacking the ability to throw lightning in order to kill a guard holding a lever. I spent more time than I care to admit exploring the nearby area, certain that there must be an alternative path or solution. Eventually, I was forced to backtrack and take an alternative fault in order to gain the ability and then retrace my steps back to smite the guard and cross the bridge. Not the end of the world, but it was interesting to notice my reluctance to backtrack so far, having been coached by modern games to expect an alternative route or solution to be close by. On another note, there's a few rather infuriating battles or obstacles where you'll be tasked with moving an item whilst fighting off an endless wave of enemies that will keep spawning until you get the item to its destination. Frankly, I hope I never have to suffer through one of these again, as it's by far the closest I came to throwing my controller across the room. How about the plot? Well, this is where I think the most noticeable changes have happened. The original God of War is definitely of its time and epitomised the noughties. It's characteristically edgy and over the top in attempts to shock the audience. Kratos is presented as broody, troubled and prone to violence, the personification of a power fantasy, tearing his way through legions of enemies, mythical monsters and the gods themselves. You literally fight your way out of hell with nothing but the power of anger and shouting. The game opens with him attempting to end his life, all very edgy. It is later revealed that he was tricked by Ares into killing his own family, and his ashen appearance is due to him being cursed to wear their ashes. As a moody teen when the game was released, I was all about it. Having a borderline irredeemable anti-hero protagonist on the warpath was all the rage at the time. We're talking The Bride, Odaisu, and hell, even Shrek. Granted, he wasn't quite as irredeemable and bloodthirsty, but you could definitely make a case. It was a period where heroes had to be flawed, villains were relatable, and Kratos straddled the line between both. The over-the-top violence and indulgent gore feels like a middle finger to the ever-persistent cries that video games are corrupting the youth.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
A still small but growing games industry was beginning to experiment with cinematic techniques and different types of storytelling. Still in its relative infancy compared to literature and cinema, games were still quite heavy-handed, and given the bulk of the audience was probably 16-year-old boys, the power trip Rage Monster worked. I don't care what the parental ratings were on these games, every kid I knew was playing God of War, and GTA, and the rest of them. The backstory sets you up for a revenge story, perhaps even redemption, a genre older than Shakespeare and perfectly at home in the ancient Greek setting. The setting undoubtedly played a huge role in the success of the series. Greek mythology wasn't just something we heard about in school. A year later, it would make a similarly bloody splash on the big screen in 300. Halo's Master Chief was a Spartan, and Greek mythology was popping up all over the place, in a similar way to Vikings would have found themselves at the centre of many a TV show and feature film in the following decade. The gods and mythical creatures we'd all heard of helped flesh out the world and provide intrigue and moments of recognition. Plus, let's be honest, the Greek gods and myths were just fucking cool. In typical fashion, at the end of the story, the gods are revealed to have once again played Kratos. Whilst they can forgive his sins, they cannot take away his nightmares and feelings of guilt. A surprisingly poignant message for a hack-and-slash bloodbath. It is here that the timeline rejoins the opening of the game, and Kratos attempts to take his own life. But the gods are not done with him yet, and he is offered the position of the new God of War. Over the next 2 games, we would see his villainous path of rage and destruction as he overthrew the gods, arguably with justification, but with undeniably destructive consequences, and a callous lack of concern for whoever else is unfortunate enough to get caught in his path. So does it feel weird to see this iteration of Kratos in comparison to the more restrained recent iteration? Well, not really. It actually feels like quite a natural progression, both as a character and as a part of the industry. The industry has matured and grown in popularity and mainstream appeal. A Rage Monster power trip fantasy feels hollow, and would likely result in many a shout of toxic masculinity today. The over-the-top gore that fed into your sense of being an unstoppable force would feel out of place today. Games still have violence and gore, sure, but they don't indulge in it to quite the same degree, at least not often. The modern games industry just doesn't need to be so edgy. It is now the mainstream, arguably bigger than cinema. The storytelling too has become more nuanced and complex, and so too have the characters. Kratos has also matured. He is not the younger, more impulsive and quick to anger man. He has seen the consequences of his past actions, with the end of God of War 3 and the death of Pandora in particular giving Kratos pause for thought. Whilst he is still undoubtedly capable of violence, he is more measured. His anger is more directed, a weapon to be aimed rather than an all-consuming force that destroys everyone and everything around him. Controlling that internal rage is something we've seen in stories before, but for my money, Kratos and his taming of his anger is one of the best told. No one is going to claim he's Father of the Year, or the picture of the ideal man, but like most men, as he's aged, as the industry that birthed him has aged, his predilection to violence, his need to tear up the status quo and fight against the powers that be they gods or critics, have all quietened. He is now more in control, protecting himself and his son from the harm his anger can and has caused. He is still an arsehole who is willing to sacrifice innocence, whether actively or through inaction, if it furthers his own goals. But he's a long way from the Rage Monster that tore apart the gods. And he's an arsehole that the broader, more mature and media-savvy audience can get behind. So then, what of the game's long-term impact? Well, the original Game of War trilogy became synonymous with quick-time events. Without it popularizing the mechanic as a way to have players feel some control over cinematic set pieces, it's possible that games may look quite different, especially titles like Uncharted. That said, QuickTime events were not unique to God of War, and it's likely their use would have been picked up eventually. Similarly, the series has evolved and has practically left this staple of the franchise behind, focusing on a more refined combat system. The rest of the gameplay was already fairly common. Devil May Cry, another game for edgy teens will revisit, arguably had a greater depth to the hack and slash genre of gameplay and came out some years earlier. The gameplay then was no revolution at the time, but definitely a satisfying step in refining mechanics that work. Thematically, we've already discussed how the newer games show a more mature Kratos, not immune from anger, but more aware of the damage it can cause and vigilant in his efforts to control his impulses. This maturing reflects the industry's coming of age too, with video game budgets regularly competing with and even dwarfing film budgets. Video games are no longer the purview of kids, teens and nerds, but are a mainstream staple that now supports not only a huge industry in itself, but a variety of offshoots, such as content creation and streaming. God of War's vengeance story is as old as time, but its edginess and moody rage monster protagonist feel very of their time. Audiences are broader, increasingly female and more mature. Male power fantasies are not enough to appeal to them. The teenage boys that will have been the bulk of the original trilogy's audience have also matured, grown into men, mellowed, and now seek a greater depth in characters when they pick up the newer iterations. I'd wager that many, like me, can relate to a man who has had to overcome his anger but still occasionally struggles. It's a tribute to the developers that Kratos has been so well adapted for these modern audiences. The original character was great for the time but wouldn't hold up today, and it would be unfair to expect him to. The original games, however, lay a great groundwork for this more mature Kratos, with a depth modern audiences can appreciate that feels earned. Fundamentally, games have grown up. Their stories and characters have to too. And Santa Monica Studio nailed it. Well, this was the first video in hopefully a little series I'm going to be putting together in the future, so if you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, and hopefully there'll be some more for you soon.